Hello and welcome back. This is Dawn with another video for Honeybee Stamps. Today we are going to be doing watercolor 3 ways. So whether you are a novice and new to watercolor or you're a little bit more experienced, there should be something here for everyone. Now all 3 projects today are going to be using the same stamp set, and we're going to finish each card off a little differently. All of the main imagery today is coming from the Everything Beautiful stamp set illustrated by Kelly Taylor. This is a gorgeous set, and the focus is on tulips and alstroemeria here. You can see you've got this large floral bouquet, and then you have these individual ones that are exact replicas of the florals in the large bouquet, so you can also layer those over to create like a decoupage effect. All right, so like I mentioned, we're going to be doing watercolor 3 ways, and this first way is by far the easiest, and I used to do this all the time. In fact, this is the technique that first started me on my watercolor journey. So I'm going to heat emboss this image. I'm working on Distress Watercolor cardstock, the smooth side, and I'm stamping my image in Versamark ink. I'm then going to add my embossing powder and melt that with my heat tool. Now you could use white, gold, clear, black, any color heat embossing you want. Heat embossing creates those raised edges, and this is going to create little wells that'll hold our water. And you'll see here when we get to the watercolor portion. But I'm going to go ahead and cover this entire background with the heat embossed pattern. Now this image, though it is large, the flowers that make up the image are quite small. So this is a good candidate for this for an all over background, and it's very, very easy to get great results. All right, with our background ready to go, we're going to start our painting, and I'm working with just a number 4 paintbrush here. You can use whatever you're most comfortable with, and we're going to be working with Distress ink. So again, Distress ink was the first thing that got me started on my watercolor journey. They are water reactive and they move really well with water. So this is just an alternative to using traditional watercolors if all you have on hand is Distress ink or any water reactive ink. So the first thing you're going to do is lay down some clean water on each petal. So those heat embossed lines are going to create little wells that will hold the water, and then you can just drop your pigment or your ink into, and then it will just spread with the water. So water is the vehicle that moves the ink around. If I were to just put this dry straight onto the paper, the ink would go nowhere. It's the water that actually carries that ink and moves it around. So you'll start by wetting an area, and then you can drop ink in. You can also put the ink down and then use a damp brush to pull that ink across the petal. You can see me doing that here. So there's several different approaches to this. If you want a more controlled look, maybe you want to start by putting down a little bit of ink at the bottom and then the top of the petal, then use your damp brush. So rinse that off, take most of the water out, and then use that damp brush to help move and bridge those 2 areas of color. Alternately, you can flood the area with water. You don't want it to be a pool of water, but you want the surface of that paper to be wet, and then you can just drop the ink in. When the ink catches that water, it's going to flow wherever the water is. So again, this is super fast, super easy, and probably the easiest way to do watercolor, because these the heat embossed lines act kind of like bumper lanes, right? So they're, think of bowling and you put up those little bumpers along the edges to keep your ball out of the gutter. Same thing here. Those lines create little bumpers that hold that water into each area, and it won't go outside of the embossed lines. So you don't have to worry about your watercolor going everywhere. The same principle applies as if you're coloring anything. The petals that are in the background, they're going to be darker. Where the petals touch each other, they'll be darker. So what I like to do is I like to lay down my water and then drop my pigment or my ink in the areas where I want it to be darkest. So here, that would be at the base of the petal, and then at some areas on the tips of the petal. Again, use that damp brush to just kind of move that ink around, and then get out of there. Just leave it. You're going to want to keep messing with it. It always turns out better if you just let it do its thing. Just drop that pigment and then move on to something else. Now this is also a great technique for practicing those color blends, because we have those embossed lines which will contain all the color in those areas. So for instance, on my tulips there, I used a little bit of seedless preserves and dropped some shaded lilac in there too. So I got some beautiful color transitions, and I didn't have to worry about them going outside of the actual flower itself, because that heat embossing keeps it in place. The same is true for our leaves. So you can see here I'm dropping crushed olive and mowed lawn in together in the same areas, but they're going to blend beautifully together without going into, say, the purples or anything like that, because those heat embossed lines are going to hold them right in place. And this, again, that water, the way that it moves and carries those inks, it's going to create these beautiful transitions and blends that are really hard to achieve manually. This is always best left to chance, and you get some really unexpected, beautiful results. I'm going to continue my way around this entire panel using the same method, laying down a little bit of clean water and then dropping my inks into that water and allowing the water to just kind of move that ink around. You'll notice that one purple flower there, I didn't cleanly stamp it, so my lines were not there. However, I knew this was going to be a background, so I did not worry about it. I will eventually end up covering up that portion that I don't love with the sentiment at the end. So again, this is one of those very, very forgiving techniques. Even though I don't even have the image fully stamped right there on that one tulip, it's not going to matter. We're going to have so much interest and color going on in the background that that little boo-boo isn't going to stand out. I could have started over, but I figured I'd let you guys, see how I handle when something doesn't go exactly as planned, which is quite often. But you just roll with it. Sometimes those boo-boos turn out to be blessings in disguise, because you find out things that you try new things that you might not have tried in order to fix that mistake. All right, so we have gone ahead and colored in the rest of our leaves. I'm just going to finish up this little bit of the alstroemeria. And for that, I am using the abandoned coral and a little bit of picked raspberry. I like that the abandoned coral runs a little bit more red and warm. The picked raspberry leans a little more purple and it's cool. So I do like to you guys know, I like to mix my warm and cool colors. I think that it just adds a lot more interest to the piece. Here, I'm just elevating that warm and cool color contrast by including it in one petal. So a lot of the times your shadows tend to be cooler. So by dropping the cooler color at the base and the warmer color at the tip, and then letting them meet in the middle, you can give the illusion of more of a shadow without even trying. And I'm going to just continue working my way around this again, this time filling in all of the pinks and then filling in wherever I missed with the greens. Now, because we are working with white heat embossing on white paper, it can be really hard to see exactly what everything is. So you'll notice there on the right hand side, I have the stamp carrier sheet. This is for me to kind of glance over at and make sure that I am capturing everything as it is. So there, it's a little bit easier to tell what is what than it is when you have white heat embossing on a white background. This is something that I also do sometimes with the no line painting, which we will do in our last card. Because when you're working with no line coloring, it's a very, very light ink, and sometimes it can be hard to see as well. All right, so here's the finished florals. We are going to add background color, but for now, this is where we are with the florals. You can see all of these beautiful color blends and variations that we have with the lights and the darks, and it was very, very minimal effort. And the distress colors I used were Shaded Lilac, Wild Honey, Seedless Preserves, Crushed Olive, Mowed Lawn, Brushed Corduroy, Picked Raspberry, and Abandoned Coral. So we will come back to this card, but for now we're going to move on to our second watercolor technique. So this time we're going to drop those bumpers and we're going to stamp in a waterproof ink. We don't want anything water soluble here because we want our lines to remain and be visible. I personally like to stamp in a brown ink when I do my watercolor. I think that it just has this more little vintage feel, but you could absolutely do it in black as well, or even a colored ink. The important thing here is you just want to make sure that it's waterproof because you don't want those lines to disperse. So for this one, we're going to use a lot of the same techniques that we used in the last one. Again, the main difference is that we don't have those bumpers to keep everything in its place. So any two areas that you paint next to each other, if two areas are wet, those areas will bleed into each other. Remember, the pigment moves anywhere that the water is wet, anywhere that the water is wet, anywhere that the paper is wet. So if you don't want your colors blending together, you'll want to jump around the image. So you can see here, I've done one petal and then I moved over to another flower and did another petal. Now, honestly, I don't always do this. I like to show it, especially for beginner levels, because until you learn how to control the water and until you learn how different loads of pigment react with different amounts of water, it can be difficult to control. So I normally, I'm not very careful about not painting next to areas that are wet, unless I'm doing detail. For my first layer though, I usually do not care if two areas run into each other. But when you're learning, it's easiest to never paint two areas that are wet side by side. So that's why you see me kind of skipping around here for demonstration purposes. And I'm trying not to paint next to two areas that are wet. Again, I like to lay down a little bit of pigment, then use the damp brush to pull that pigment out. Alternately, you can use the two brush method where I load one brush with the pigment and then the other brush is just my clear water. So here I'm laying down a little bit of pigment and then I switch to the other brush and I move those pigments towards each other so that they'll meet in the middle. Again, lay down a little bit of pigment, again, where I want the color the darkest. And then I'll use the damp brush to merge and marry those two areas. This can be a very quick process, especially when you're using the two brush method. It eliminates the need to keep rinsing your brush and it helps to waste less pigment. You've always got one brush loaded with that color and the other brush is used exclusively for, just moving that pigment across the paper. So it can make quick work of coloring in these images. All right, so I've jumped ahead a little bit here and I've sped this up quite a bit. We do have 3 paintings to get through and I don't want to keep you guys here too long. I've noticed that if my videos are about a half an hour long, you guys tend to like those. If I go over that, those videos don't get as many views. Or maybe it's the content. I know my last video was it my last one or the one prior? The Copic colored octopuses, the views on that were extremely low. It was a longer video, but I did want to show the entire process of coloring the 2 octopuses. So it was, maybe I should have shortened it. You guys let me know. Is it because it was Copics or was it the length? If you haven't watched that one, I'd love to know. Maybe you guys just prefer watercolor over here. I don't know. You got to let me know. All right, so I'm not going for hyperrealism or photorealism here. That's not what I try to achieve with watercolor. You most certainly can, but for me, it is the movement of the color and the color play that I am so drawn to in watercolor. So that's more of what I focus on, the contrast between the lights and the darks, and then just the flow of the color. So it's really up to you to find your personal style when it comes to watercolor or any coloring for that matter. They're all beautiful and they all have their place, but it'll just be what you are drawn to and what you like to do best. Okay, so for these first 2 cards, we have been working on Distress Watercolor cardstock, and I personally feel like Distress inks do work best on the Distress Watercolor cardstock or a heavy mixed media paper. Anything that's got a generous amount of sizing on it. So sizing is the coating that's either inside or on top of the paper, and it prevents the water and the ink from absorbing into the paper too fast, which would cause the ink to stain the paper and not move freely across the surface of the paper. Whereas traditional watercolor paper, it does allow more of the ink to soak in a little bit quicker. It's not quite as heavily sized as some of these mixed media papers, and especially this Distress Watercolor cardstock. So I do find that Distress inks work best on this paper. Now for our last card, we are going to be working on traditional watercolor paper, and we're going to be working with traditional watercolors. So I'm using the Fabriano Artistico Extra White hot pressed watercolor paper and the Mungyo 48 half pan palette. I love this watercolor palette. It is perfect for crafting, and I've been using it now for several years, and you can see here that there is still plenty of it. So I just think that this is a great economical choice for those of us who are just getting into watercolor. Now I'm using hot press paper because it is smoother than your cold press. Cold press has a little more texture. It takes a little bit more water, but when I'm using stamped images, I prefer hot pressed 90% of the time. Now, if you've never used watercolor paper on a block, it is gummed on usually 3 sides, sometimes all sides but 1 corner. You'll find the loose area, slide your palette knife in, and then slide that along the edges to release your top sheet of paper. Now, you could paint directly on the block, leave the paper on the block, and then remove it once you're done. But since I'm going to be using my MISC to stamp, I've gone ahead and released a piece of paper. Now for my stamping, I used Distress ink and antique linen. That is my favorite. I've pulled out my water, my paper towel, my paints, and then primarily I will be using the Princeton Velvet Touch number 5 round watercolor brush here. And then I've also pulled out my number 0 and number 2 Princeton Heritage 4050 series round brushes. Now, all three of these are some of my favorite brushes, and I will have links below to those if you want to check them out. I pick up all of my brushes at Blick. They are the best price, hands down, and I've never had an issue ordering from Blick. So you can see here that these brushes all have a very beautiful fine point, and I can do the majority of this image with this one brush. If I need to get into tighter spaces, like I said, I've got my number 2 and my number 0 on standby. So I'll use many of the same techniques that I used on the previous two. You can put down your color and then use your damp brush to pull that color. You can pre-wet a petal and then drop color in. You can do a mixture of both. Here you'll notice that I continually dip my brush in water and take off the excess water and then come into the painting. Each time I dip my brush into the water, I'm removing or diluting some of the pigment on the brush. So it's like I am gradually lightening that color on the brush, but I always make sure to tap it on my paper towel to remove excess water from it. What I don't want to do is flood this image with a lot of water. We're not going for that super loose, washy watercolor look here, so we want to control our water and our pigment a little bit more. And we don't have those embossed lines to contain our pigment in one area. And likewise, our lines are much, much lighter than they were in the previous image. So you'll notice that I'm going to bolster up my difference between my highlights and my shadows here. So I'm going to go deeper in places that I want to look recessed or behind other areas, and I'm going to allow a lot of lighter areas to shine through. In some places, I'm even going to leave the white of the paper. That white of the paper is going to be my brightest highlights. So I really need to play with my lights and darks here to separate each of these petals. Anywhere that I have a very light area, it's going to look like it's in the front or on the top of something. Anywhere that it's really, really dark, it's going to look like it's in shadow or it's behind another thing. Again, I'm not going for photorealism here either. This is still a good beginner level technique. Those beginners who are just trying to advance their watercolor a little bit, here you can start paying more attention to separating one object from another just by using your color tones and your color shades. But you don't have to worry about direction, light direction, or shadow colors. You don't have to get too much into color transitions. You can add different colors in here just to make it a little more interesting. So for instance, I chose a more of a pinky violet here, and then in some areas maybe I'll add a little bit more blue to that or a little bit more pink to it and start painting with that. But I'm not trying to get too much. I'm not getting too crazy here, so it's still a good beginner level. I'm just concentrating on differentiating my lights and my darks. Once you get that down, you can start playing with those other things. Then start concentrating maybe on playing with your light direction. Start playing with your cast shadows. Start working on transitioning from, yellow in the center of the flower into a purple on the tips of the flower, things like that. But first, the very first thing you need to do is get comfortable painting, without the bumpers, learning your water to pigment ratio, learning how much water is too much water, learning how far your pigments will flow with water, all of that. The second technique helps you with. You still have the lines to give you the structure of the flowers, but you just have to concentrate on the water and the pigment ratios. And then once you're comfortable with that, you can move on to this technique, which is where you're dropping those lines that give you the structure. Now you need to create the structure using your lights and your darks. So proper placement of your lights and your darks are going to create the shapes of the flowers. It's going to separate one petal from the other and separate the flowers themselves from each other. So that's what this technique is really good for. Don't overwhelm yourself. Don't worry about light direction. Don't worry about proper shadow colors and all of that. Keep it very simple and just concentrate on your lights and your darks, because you need to learn how to create the structures of these things using your lights and darks. Once you're comfortable with that, you can move into light direction, move into color blending, fading from, like, say, a yellow into a purple without getting mud. All of these things are things that you can work on once you're comfortable with that pigment to water ratio, and then creating structure with your highlights and your shadows. So again, this is a perfect way to practice that. Just don't overwhelm yourself with trying to pack too much learning or too much information in the image. Use it as a learning tool to improve your skill. And don't overwhelm yourself with too many things to learn at once. Master one thing and then move on to the next. All right, so we're going to speed this up quite a bit more. I want to point out that you do not have to achieve perfection in your first layer with watercolor. The wonderful thing about watercolor is it is a transparent medium, so you can continue to layer colors one on top of the other once they're dry. The important thing is to let each layer dry. Remember, wet on wet blends, wet on dry builds. So the best thing to do if you're unsure about an area, 100% leave it to dry. Let it dry and reassess it once it's dry. 9 times out of 10, you will be much happier with it if you walk away and come back and look at it again with fresh eyes. Too often, we get caught up in how we wanted it to look, and we don't appreciate it for how it looks. So walking away kind of resets your eye. When you come back and look at it with fresh eyes, you usually will not recognize whatever it was that was bothering you. It will not stand out. Now, if it does stand out and you come back and it still stands out, then obviously do some work on it. But I'm telling you, 9 times out of 10, whatever it was that was bugging you so much, when you come back with those fresh eyes, it will no longer bother you. Happens to me all the time, even now. I will obsess over an area, or I will hate a painting because of one area that didn't turn out exactly how I wanted it to. When I leave and come back, I don't even know what I was thinking. It doesn't bother me anymore. And that happened to me with this one here as well. These Alstroemeria, they were killing me. I've been doing a lot more loose watercolor, expressive watercolor lately than I have this more detailed watercolor. So usually I can finish the painting in one layer, and then my second layer is like details. But when you come in to do paintings like this, you can do 3-4 layers. You're going to start very light and you're going to progressively get darker with each layer. Like I said, watercolor is a transparent medium, so you can build that color. You don't want to go dark because you can't take away the color. So you build the color. Start light and then start building in your deeper colors. Now, because I have been doing more of the loose expressive watercolor, you kind of come in, you want to get 90% of that painting done on your first layer. Then, like I said, the second layer is usually your detail layer, which is a little bit different than this. And so I had been used to painting in that style. That was where my mindset was. So when I came in to do this one, it's like riding a bike, you kind of got to warm up again. You never really forget. And once you get on the bike and you start going, you're like, oh, yeah, I remember. Same with this. So initially they were killing me. They were annoying me that they were not done in one layer. And then I had to remind myself, Dawn, let it dry. Let it dry and come add your darker color. Come in and add your details. You can do that 3, 4, 5 layers. Just don't overwork it. Overworking it happens 99% of the time when you try to do too much while it's wet. You gotta let those colors dry in between. And that's what you see me doing here. The entire painting is dry, and now I'm coming in with some deep greens to do a little bit of negative painting. So these leaves are all coming in toward the center of this bouquet. You've got stems from the tulips coming out of the center, and right now they're all about the same level of shade. So they don't really have that depth. Right? You can't tell which one is on top of the other. They're all about the same shade of green. So now I'm coming in with a darker green, and I'm creating some depth there at the center of the bouquet, and then we're pushing some of the leaves further into the background. We're recessing them by adding a little bit of a darker, more muted green to some areas of those leaves. So where they're in this very center of that bouquet, they need to be a little more darker and muted. And then where they are behind the stems of the tulips, they need to be darker because they need to look like they're behind those stems. So by just coming in and adding these little shots of darker, more desaturated color, it's going to force them into the shadows and then make them look like they are recessing away from the eye, which will cause the things that are in front to come forward and look like they're coming at you. So I'll just continue working my way around the image, adding in that negative painting to force some of those areas into the background and to pop some of those foreground areas forward. Likewise, I'll also go in and add a little bit more of some deeper color. So on the tips of some of these petals, I'm going to re-wet the petal and then drop a little bit more of that pinkish red. Let that kind of travel its way down the petal. And this is going to add a shot of deeper color at the tips of those petals and add some contrast into this painting. So I don't want to do it to every petal. I'm just going to do it to a few here and there, and it's really going to make these flowers pop. Okay, so let's take a look at the 3 finished panels, and it's time to turn these into cards. We're going to start with this one. Now, I have added a blue wash into the background, and for that I used Salty Ocean. Again, I just wet the background and then dropped that Salty Ocean in and let it move wherever it wanted. In some places I did help move it with a brush, but for the most part I just let it flow. To finish it off, we're going to do a bold sentiment. This is one of my favorite things to do for a all over busy background like this. A nice bold die cut sentiment will finish this off perfectly. So I'm going to take the happy birthday die here and we're going to die cut this from white. I'm going to do the shadow die from white, and then I'm going to use a little bit of ink blending to color the happy birthday sentiment there. Now you could have colored your paper first and then die cut from it, but I thought about this after. So I'm going to use a little bit of that same yellow, which is the Wild Honey, to color this. I've got it stuck down to a sticky mat here, and then I'm just going to use a paper pouncer here to pounce the color on. This is going to hold everything in place and apply my color very quickly, and I'm not going to worry about damaging or misshaping the die cut because I'm not using a brushing motion or an ink blending motion. I'm literally just pouncing the ink on, and I find this the best way to apply ink to any delicate die cuts that you don't want to distort or misshape when you're coloring them. Now alternately, if you don't have paper pouncers, you could use a brush. If you decided to ink blend after you die cut, just fit your die cut back into the negative space, put it on your grippy mat, and then just ink blend over it. Fitting it back into that negative space is going to keep it from moving around, and you'll be able to apply your ink too. I used a little bit of liquid adhesive to adhere this to the shadow die, and then that will go right in the center of my card. And we'll review this card at the end. For now, let's move on to our second card and how we finish that out. Okay, so for this one, I decided to do a mini slimline card, and we're going to die cut our image here. So I'm going to go ahead and tape this in place and use the coordinating die to die cut my floral arrangement here, and then I'm going to end up cutting this into pieces and rearranging it on the background. But first, I'm going to add some interest to the background with a 3D embossing folder. And for that, we're going to use the new Sandy's Garden 3D embossing folder. Here you can see this is a gorgeous, gorgeous folder of this full floral background that I absolutely love. So here I'm just deciding exactly which portion I want to use on my background. Here we have a little cameo from Aster. She decided to join me on the desk. For a split second there, I forgot that I was filming, and then I realized, oh my goodness, I need to get you down. She cannot resist getting up there and messing with everything when I'm crafting, you guys. Okay, so I went ahead and ran this through my Platinum 6, and you can see this has so much beautiful detail. It is just, oh, so good. And it's going to be the perfect backdrop for these florals. So I've gone ahead and trimmed this piece into 3 separate pieces, and I'm going to arrange them here in like a visual triangle. And then I'll finish this off with a sentiment. Now, all of these cards are rather simply finished because I put all of the effort into the actual focal points. So let's go ahead and review all 3 finished cards. And I absolutely love the way they turned out. Okay, so for our first card, we have our easiest watercolor method. Again, we just heat embossed in white, added some water, dropped our color in, and then finished this off with a big, bold die cut sentiment. Super easy technique that always makes a big impact and is great for beginners. So then we stepped it up a notch with our second technique here. We dropped those bumpers, but we retained the structure by using our stamping, but use the same basic watercoloring technique. We added that 3D embossing folder in the background, and our sentiment is also from that Everything Beautiful stamp set, and finished it off with some pearls. Love the way this one turned out. And then finally, for our third watercolor technique, we did the no line watercoloring. This time we had to retain all of the structure using our shadows and our highlights, and then we made sure to come in and bolster up some of those darks and brighten up some pops of color just to give it some contrast. Again, we finished it off with a sentiment from that Everything Beautiful set. So there you have 3 ways to watercolor covering various skill levels using the same stamp set. I'd love to know in the comments below which is your favorite. Have you tried these before, or which one are you wanting to try? Let me know. All of the featured supplies that I used in today's video will be linked in the description box below. If you haven't already, make sure that you're subscribed so you don't miss any future videos. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. As always, I want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.